Meine Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde, I had an intention to bring Stefan Treubst to Bucharest over the last few years, and definitely since I started this project, Ideas in the Agora, and it so happened that in pretty much the same time, the municipality of Bucharest and the municipality of Leipzig rediscovered the ancient connections between the two sites, and they started an exchange of visits at the highest level, Lord Mayors, City Hall experts, museum specialists, and things of the same. Indeed, as we know, it's not by accident that one of the streets in Bucharest, the old town, is called Lipscan. At the time, communication was taking place mostly in Ottoman Turkish and in Greek. Now we switched to English. In all these circumstances, the German language is excluded. Let them be excluded tonight as well. But if you want to intervene in the discussion in German later on, please do so, and I'll function as an interpreter. Stefan Treubst has a long connection to Central and Eastern Europe, which goes back to his early years as a student, when he started to specialize in the history of especially Eastern Europe, Slavic-speaking Eastern Europe, then further into the studies of the Balkans. But he was always interested in this area writ large, in something that he later came to theorize as a historical mesoregion. Stepping in the footsteps of an illustrious predecessor in Germany and looking at human geography and geographical and historical theories regarding this area, he came to see it really as a whole, as something that comes in between a continent and a civilization crisis or cultural crisis, something that is connected in many ways and has a certain coherence, this meso-region. He has, as a Slavicist, as a historical theorist, I mentioned this, which is in fact a Leipzig constant. There is a certain obsession in Leipzig, at the University of Leipzig, from times immemorial, with space and spatiality. There's a tradition at the University of Leipzig to discuss space. As you might know, the creators of anthropogeography in the 19th century were there, and Leipzig was a central focal point of theories of collective identities from roughly the 1880s up to World War I, and then continued in different forms. Scholars from all over the place in Central and Eastern Europe were returning the favor. The objects of Leipzig scholars' curiosities became curious about these universities in East Germany, and started to go to, as you know, to universities such as those in Berlin, in Jena, of course in Leipzig, in Halle, and a few other places. And out of this, let's say, commonality of scholarly interests and of common academic training, there resulted a number of threads in scholarship and in culture more generally that lasted until World War II, with whatever you can imagine that happened between World War I and World War II, the kind of contents and of ideas that were circulating between the countries. He covered chronologically and spatially a large territory in his research, and he has been instrumental, I would say. I see it from the outside and also a little bit from the inside, instrumental into the repositioning of the University of Leipzig as a major center of the historical learning after the changes. For instance, I can hardly ignore the fact that their center for the study of Central and Eastern Europe is the most important in Germany. I think is the place where the most interesting research projects have been conducted or initiated. Of course, yes, you will see the other information there, the information here in the fine print. He came as close to Romania as one can possibly come by spending time in and on the Republic of Moldova, our neighbor. And so thus in many ways he is also familiar with developments in the history and culture of Romania. In Bulgaria, he was, of course, very easily spotted by the secret police, by the very intrepid, if not brilliant, secret police of the time. At age 21, as a young student coming from Germany, of all places, to Bulgaria. And since, as we were discussing earlier, even the nationalists in these countries are not fully persuaded of the merit of their own object of affection. So they do not trust foreigners who show up on their step to study them. They do not think that this can be a genuine form of curiosity or of scholarly interest, but rather they immediately believe that they are foreign spies. So, well, I cannot beat the logic of the Bulgarian Secret Service and militia. He was, of course, seeing what most secret agents would never understand, that is, the fabric of Bulgarian society, the secrets, really, of the functioning of such regimes. So in 1989, he could see also the reasons and the ways in which these regimes are falling throughout the Balkans. This is the topic of his presentation tonight. I'm very happy that Stefan Trost is with us as a colleague and as an old friend. I'm really very, very happy and proud to introduce Stefan Trost to you. Stefan, go.
Thanks a lot, Sorin, for the kind introduction. You're perfectly right that the interest in space is still alive and kicking in Leipzig. Recently, we got a huge amount of money from the German Research Council for a program involving some 20 scholars entitled Spatialization under the Global Condition. And by the way, Leipzig hosts the only Moldova institute outside the Republic of Moldova. Small, but still.
At the initiative of Klaus Bockmann,
yes,
this great specialist in Romanian studies and political ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah. Using a Moldovan expatriate.
Okay, the geography of the Annus mirabilis 1989 shows an East Central Europe consisting of Poland and Hungary, as well as, with some months' delay, GDR and Czechoslovakia, all that on the background of perestroika in the USSR. Southeastern Europe was not affected by all that. What in Bulgaria was termed change, promiana, in Romania even revoluția, were in fact palace revolts within the ruling communist elite, only mere imitations of what previously had happened in Warsaw, Budapest, and Leipzig. At a time when in East Central Europe, state socialist regimes collapsed under the attack by oppositional movements, the party dictatorships of the Balkans increased the pressure towards conformity on the majority populations. On the other hand, they tightened considerably the screw on national minorities. Gerontocrats like Todor Zhivkov, since 1954 head of the Bulgarian Communist Party, the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, since 1965 in office, and Nejmie Hoxha, widow of the long-standing Albanian leader Enver Hoxha, were figureheads. The same goes for the new strongman in the Yugoslav Republic of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic. 2 weeks after, on August 24, 1989, Tadeusz Mazowiecki was elected as the first non-communist prime minister of post-war Poland, and 1 month before the victory of what is called the Peaceful Revolution in GDR in Leipzig on October 9, the Balkan correspondent of Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Viktor Meyer, published an article with an, on the first glance, tautological title, "The Balkans Become the Balkans Again." Also, the subtitle read somewhat cryptically, "The Work of Zhivkov, Ceausescu and Milosevic." What Meyer had in mind was the massive and systematic violation of human rights in Bulgaria, Romania and Yugoslavia by the nationalist, even racist nationality policies of the three Balkan autocrats. In the article, Meyer described three phenomena. First, the apartheid-like Serbian occupation regime established in the spring of 1989 in the up-to-then autonomous province of Kosovo. Second, the policy of forced urbanization in Romania, for which the euphemism systematization had been coined, and which was perceived as a threat, first of all, by Hungarians, Germans, and other national minorities, of course also by Romanians. And third, the culmination of the Bulgarian policy of forced assimilation of the Turkish minority, labeled Renaissance Process, in the form of a state-sponsored flight hysteria of hundreds of thousands of Bulgarian Turks, who within a few weeks, stricken by panic, fled to Turkey. The geographic region of the Balkans, thus Meyer's argument, was by now once again congruent with the negative regional stereotype with the same name, Balkans, a stereotype standing for bakshish and blood revenge, corruption and violence, backwardness and national superiority complex. In Meyer's view, 1989 symbolized the beginning of a re-Balkanization of the Balkans in the worst sense of the word. In the following, I will look at the processes taking place in Southeastern Europe during the year of 1989. First, forced assimilation, flight hysteria and palace revolt in Bulgaria. Second, destruction of villages, pauperization and tyrannicide in Romania. Third, secession of the center, apartheid regime and federal erosion in Yugoslavia, particularly in Serbia. Four, a side glance on the flickering beacon of socialism in Europe, as the saying went at the time, that is the Albania after Enver Hoxha. And five, Greece, a Balkan country where the changes of 1989 in the region went almost unnoticed. My first case study, Bulgaria. In Viktor Meyer's quoted view, the most extreme of his three cases of 1989 in the Balkans was exactly Bulgaria. This because the policy of forced assimilation of the 900,000 Turkish-speaking Muslims initiated in 1984 resulted in the month of June to August 1989 in a governmental policy aiming at driving more than a third of this population out of the country. The results were, among else, a decrease of the overall population of the country by 5%, a depopulation of large parts of the country's east, and serious economic problems. What in 1984 had begun as a forcibly change of Arabic Islamic names, patronyms, and surnames into Slavic Christian forms, a move met by the victims with smoldering hatred and occasional terrorist attempts, brought interethnic relations to ground zero. Earlier in 1989, the exodus of the Turks from Bulgaria had been preceded by 3, on the first sight, unrelated events and processes. The tension between state and minority escalated in the form of mass protests and demonstrations. Also within and outside the Communist Party, a small but influential dissident movement emerged. And finally, in the BCP's Central Committee and Politburo, discontent with the high-handed Zhivkov was growing due to his neglect of the dynamics of Soviet perestroika. In the spring of 1989, Bulgarian Turks staged hunger strikes and other protest actions, which by May spread to all of eastern Bulgaria. This resulted in an overstretch of the security forces, compensated by overreactions in face of the protests and resulting in the death of some 30 demonstrators. The organizers of the protests used the occasion of the CSE Conference on Human Dimensions to be opened on 29 May in Paris to step up their actions. In this situation, the increasingly helpless regime decided to make a U-turn. On the same day, May 29, Zhivkov announced in a TV and radio speech that passports would be issued to all citizens intending to go abroad. And on June 3, Bulgaria opened the border to Turkey. Up to August 21st, when Ankara closed the border due to congestion, an estimated number of 344,000 Turcophone Bulgarian citizens had left the country. At a meeting of the BCP's Politburo with the first secretaries of the party's regional committees on June 7, Zhivkov declared the mass flight a success, and I quote him, "After this declaration of May 29, the uprisings in the country have stopped. We are on the threshold of a giant emigration psychosis. How should we evaluate this psychosis? Such a psychosis is for us indispensable. It is heaven sent. I'll tell you now something which has to be kept a secret. If we do not manage to get 200 to 300,000 people of this population group out of the country, then Bulgaria will in 15 years no longer exist. The country will then be like Cyprus or something similar." Unquote. The reference to Cyprus aimed, of course, at the invasion of the armed forces of Turkey on the island in 1974 and at the establishment of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus there. So obviously, Zhivkov was thinking of a similar scenario, Eastern Bulgaria becoming a Turkish republic. The political pressure from within, reinforced by an economic crisis as well as by parallel external events in China, Poland, GDR, and USSR, threw the Bulgarian party and state leadership into growing confusion, resulting in erratic announcement of reforms in the fields of social and health policy, which were strongly resented by the population. Successively, Zhivkov had lost support in the upper echelon of the party. On October 24, his long-standing right-hand man, Politburo member and Foreign Minister Petr Mladenov, resigned publicly from his governmental post in protest against Zhivkov's rejection of USSR and CPSU. Subsequently, Mladenov took a plane to Moscow to get a green light for toppling Zhivkov, and on a Central Committee plenum on 10 November, one day after the involuntary opening of the Berlin Wall by the East German regime, Mladenov, with the support of the majority in the Politburo, urged Zhivkov to step down from all of his functions. Simultaneously, Mladenov, took over the post of Secretary General of the party, and 1 week later also the one of the head of state. What followed was the gradual transformation of the ruling Communist Party to a leftist party of a social democratic type, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, BSP, the unification of numerous oppositional groups into a union of democratic forces, and not the least, a dramatic increase of interethnic tension in the country. The latter was due to the fact that remaining Turks, as well as some returning from Turkey now, demanded the rescission of the results of the name change campaign, as well as the readmission of the Turkish language to the public sector, and they organized week-long demonstrations and blockades in front of the parliament building in downtown Sofia. As a result, on December 29, the BSP government issued a decree fulfilling the demands of the demonstrators. This move, however, infuriated the nationalist-minded strata of Bulgarian society, particularly in the northeast and southeast of the country. The party apparatus in these ethnically mixed regions, the structures of the state security there, but also the directorate and the workforce of state-owned enterprises, as well as staffs of teachers, Orthodox priests, and others, formed on December 31st a nationwide committee for the defense of national interest. Their top demand was a referendum on the Renaissance process in order to prevent a rescission of the name change campaign and a legalization of the Turkish language. In January 1990, in many cities and towns of eastern Bulgaria, demonstrations, meetings, and autocorsi took place in support of these nationalist demands, with slogans like "In Bulgaria, only Bulgarian names," or referring to the period of Ottoman rule, 500 years are enough. Only with great difficulty and the help of the newly formed Party of the Bulgarian Turks, called Movement for Rights and Freedoms, did the government of the BSP Socialist Party succeed in reducing interethnic tension over a longer period of time. In politics of history and culture of remembrance of Bulgaria, today the campaign for forced assimilation of 84-85 and forcing the Turks to flee the country in 89 are till today the most sensitive topic, while coming to terms with the cruel communist system of forced labor camps and the so-called umbrella murders of exiled dissidents by the state security. That was a, so to speak, societal task successfully fulfilled. The so-called Renaissance process and what was called the Great Excursion, that is the mass flight of Turks to Turkey. This divides not only Turks from Bulgarians today, but also Bulgarians among themselves. It is true that the Bulgarian parliament in January 2012, 22 years after the beginning of the democratization, for the first time condemned the name change campaign, but slogans like Bulgaria for the Bulgarians or Turks out are still part of the country's political culture. My second case study is Romania. Of course, I will not carry coal to Newcastle by recounting the events of December 89 in Timișoara and Bucharest, flight and execution of the Ceausescus and so on. You know all that better than me, but the memory of Hunger Rebellion, Palace Revolt, and of the many demonstrators killed by the Securitate during the dramatic last 2 weeks of 89, in my view, obscures somewhat the recollection of the nationwide wave of anxiety about the future caused by the regime's proclamation on the intensification of what was called the systematization of settlements the year before. By a bitter irony of history, implementation of the infamous Law 58 of 1974 on, as it was called, the systematization of territory and of urban and rural localities had been accelerated by the disastrous earthquake of March 1977 in the southern part of the country. And that resulted then from 1978 on in a massive flattening of historical centers of towns and cities to make room for modern buildings. It is estimated that by 1989, in 29 cities and towns, an estimated 85% of historical building stock, including churches and cemeteries, had already been destroyed, while in another 37 cities and towns, the demolition works had just started. And as mentioned in 1989 in a speech by Ceausescu on March 3, he announced that some 5,000 to 6,000 out of Romania's total 13,000 villages were already earmarked for systematization. That means to be abandoned and replaced by what was called by 550 agro-industrial centers with housing space for a minimum of 5,000 people in each of these new agro towns. As I mentioned, events of 1989 luckily enough prevented the regime from carrying out this plan. However, the announcement by Ceausescu had serious international repercussions. In May 1988, the new reform-oriented Hungarian party leadership and government directed a sharp protest to neighboring Romania, and the Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock, together with his West German colleague Hans-Dietrich Genscher, declared the systematization campaign a violation of human rights, and an appeal of prominent intellectuals in the New York Times of January 10, 1989, caused the UN Commission on Human Rights on March 9, 1989 to condemn the destruction of villages and the repressive minority of the Ceausescu regime. Interestingly enough, with the vote of Hungary and by abstention of the Soviet Union, GDR and Bulgaria. Previously, that never had happened in this UN Commission on Human Rights. Finally, on March 16, 1989, the European Parliament issued a resolution in which not only forced international resettlement and neglect of minority rights were characterized as violations of human rights by Bucharest, but also the criminalization of birth control and abortion, as well as the compulsory hospitalization of dissidents in psychiatric clinics. By the spring of 1989, Romanian-Hungarian, Romanian-West German, Romanian-Yugoslav, even Romanian-US relations had reached a nadir, and within CSCE, at that time the most important East-West forum, the country was completely isolated. With the Romanian variety of the change of 89 and its consequences in 1990, while they were the most violent in all of Eastern Europe, the obscure regime change in Bucharest had at least this immediately positive effect of both on the titular nation and on the national minorities, preventing a systematization campaign from being carried out in the countryside. I think I will shorten a bit my section on Kosovo, since that is probably the development which, due to the unresolved question of international recognition of Kosovo, probably still is most clearly in the minds. In March 1989, as I mentioned, Milosevic by force took away the autonomous status of what was at that time called the Socialist Autonomous Province of Kosovo, and that was the beginning of a 10-year period of extreme tension in Pristina and surroundings, which then in 1998 erupted in, I would say, low-intensity warfare, and in 1999 in fully fledged warfare, including NATO airstrikes, which then led to the evacuation of the region by the Yugoslav National Army, commanded by Belgrade, and with another almost 10-year delay in 2008 proclamation of the Republic of Kosovo as an independent state, which by now is recognized by the majority of the members of the United Nations. Interestingly enough, not by all members of the European Union. For example, Spain, Slovakia. I don't know about Romania. Has Romania recognized Kosovo? Okay. Didn't. Okay. See? In the perception of Kosovars today, those living in Kosovo, and particularly the large emigration in countries like Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, 1989 marks the beginning of an extremely tragic 10-year period, which caused some 500,000 inhabitants of the region to leave the region for good. An estimated 500,000 Kosovars live in various countries of the European Union plus Switzerland. Okay, case 4 is a shorter one, Albania. While the nomenclatura of the monopolist parties and the leaderships of the state security apparatuses of Romania and Bulgaria, with some delay, imitated a sort of peaceful revolution, the almost total self-isolation of Stalinist Albania continued even after Enver Hoxha's death in 1985. I would say up to the first multi-party elections in March 1991, the prelude of the Albanian variety of democratic regime change. Hoxha's widow Necmije guarded the ideological heritage of her deceased husband. Hoxha's successor Ramiz Alia undertook not more than groping attempts for economic reforms in the field of private agriculture and in homeopathic doses a sort of opening to the outside world. Also, there were signs that the militant anti-religious policies of the regime would be eased. For example, in August 1989, Nobel Peace Laureate of Albanian origin, Mother Teresa, born in 1910 in Ottoman Üsküp, today Skopje, visited post-Hoxha Albania, where, interestingly enough, she was received by Necmije Hoxha. Parallelly, the dramatic events in the crumbling Soviet sphere of hegemony resulted in increased nervosity and tension within the Albanian party and state leadership. Now a divide between Stalinist hardliners and hesitant reformists became obvious. The dam started to burst when, in July 1990, some 5,000 demonstrators stormed Western embassies in Tirana, followed by mass protests by students in December that day. And in spring 1992, after a turbulent 91 characterized by strikes, mass protests, and state violence, the oppositional Democratic Party seized power. now the beacon of socialism in Europe, as Enver Hoxha used to call his country, went out forever in the perceptions of the Albanians of today, with an average of 30 years the youngest people in Europe. The Hoxha dictatorship is a drab yet fading away nightmare, a scheme of a grim though distant past. If at all, it is the year 1990, not 89, which is remembered as a decisive turning point and as the beginning of a new era of freedom of speech, democracy and business opportunities, but also of mass emigration, ubiquitous corruption, endemic political instability, and a revival of blood feuds with consequences, for example, a complete breakdown of overland bus traffic because almost all bus drivers are threatened by blood feuds and cannot leave their houses. And last but not least, case 5, Greece. Even compared to the whole dramatic post-war history of Greece, civil war, coup d'etat, dictatorship, party feuds, the year 1989 was one of the most tumultuous ones. This because within just 10 months, the parliament had to be re-elected 3 times until a government could be formed. Despite the fact that on June 18, 1989, the liberal conservative Nea Demokratia won over the pan-Hellenic socialist movement, PASOK. Due to the complicated electoral law, it did not succeed in forming a government. The same happened as a result of the elections of November 5, 89. Again, a non-political interim government had to take over because Nea Demokratia was not able to form a government. And only the elections of April 1990 secured Nea Demokratia a wafer-thin majority of seats. Yet in order to form a stable government, the conservatives had to turn to the extreme right, a move which had the effect that the leftist PASOK closed oppositional ranks with left-wing extremists. Thus, the ideological divide became deeper than before. Accordingly, during all of 1989, the political elite, the media, and the public in Greece were mesmerized by party politics and internal affairs. What happened to the north of the country's borders remained beyond the range of view, with one exception: the overthrow of the Bulgarian head of state and party, Todor Zhivkov, on November 10, 1989. That was the exception because, having been a close cooperation partner of the previous PASOK government of Georgios Papandreou, and together with him a protagonist of a nuclear-free zone in the Balkans, Zhivkov's removal from office was widely regretted. This not only by the notoriously anti-NATO left in Greece, but also by the many other anti-American Greeks. The former Cold War aversion against what at the time was called Slavo-communism had waned already in the wake of the Greek-instigated Cyprus crisis of '74, and since then Turkey, despite the fact that it was Greece's NATO ally, became, so to speak, replaced the threat from the East, communist threat, by a threat from, replaced the threat from the North by a threat from the East. I don't know, I couldn't find any information on the reaction of Greek political elite, government, media, on the execution of the Ceausescu's. Probably Zhivkov had in Greece more sympathy than the Ceausescu's. In their fixation on each other and on Turkey, Greek political leaders failed to realize the effect of the landslide change in Eastern Europe. on Greece's international position and its self-proclaimed rule as an intermediary between the Soviet bloc on the one hand and the West on the other. It took until September 8, 1991, when the Republic of Macedonia proclaimed independence and was first diplomatically recognized by no one other than neighboring Bulgaria, that elites and public of Greece realized that the world around them was dramatically changing. Thus, the desperate Greek attempts to support Belgrade in its efforts to turn the debris of Tito's Yugoslavia into a greater Serbia, and hence also the irrational and hysteric policy of Athens to undo the emergence of the militarily and economically weak Macedonian state by political and economic pressure, an impasse that ended only recently, last year, with the so-called Prespa Agreement. In the nostalgic retrospective of many Greeks, up to 1989, the bipolar world was an ideal one, with Greece at the hinge between East and West, when suddenly and unexpectedly complete chaos broke out in 1989. The inability of the Greek political elite to cope with the unstoppable changes in the Balkans, in East Central Europe, in the post-Soviet realm, and in the rest of the world originated in the autistic navel-gazing of 1989, a mode of behavior not unfamiliar also in the decades to come. In conclusion, despite the fact that the medium-term effects of 1989 in Bulgaria and Romania, even in Albania, were a liberalization cum democratization, the differences to the development pattern in East Central Europe are striking, and the implosion of the Yugoslav Federation resulted in interstate and civil warfare stopped temporarily by international humanitarian intervention and the Dayton Agreement of 1995. Yet the Serbian policy of repression in Kosovo, starting in '89, resulted, as I mentioned, then in 98, 99 in gigantic ethnic cleansing, and another military intervention by the international community in the form of NATO, an act of assistance in an emergency strongly criticized and partly sabotaged by the NATO member state of Greece. For many inhabitants of the former Yugoslavia, and definitely for the Kosovo Albanians, the year of 1989 was the harbinger of hard times to come, and for most Bulgarians, Romanians, and Albanians, it was an annus horribilis followed by a long phase of instability. The exception to the rule is Greece, where due to fixation on the year-long political stalemate, the epochal character of 1989 went almost unnoticed. To put it in a nutshell, in most of 1989, the citizens of the countries in questions had no anticipation. In most months of 1989, the citizens of the countries in question had no anticipation whatsoever of the dramatic changes in the near and the more distant future. Probably the smaller part of them remembers the events of 1989 as end of dictatorship, liberation, and democratizations. Others remember the hardships of this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll open the discussion with a few questions that I think were raised by this presentation. First of all, in Romania, this perspective is rather unusual because Romanians do their utmost to escape in their imagination from the Balkans. Thus, their very association with events happening in the Balkans strikes them as something extremely odd, curious, eccentric. I'll come back to this. Thus, some of the structural transformations of the Balkans that include Greece in many ways, exclude Romania in other ways. This has to do with long-term fixation of the Romanians on their neighbors to the west. There are no connections between Romanian, let's say, oppositional forces, or rather individuals, as few as they were, and their neighbors south of the Danube. Absolutely none. There are few connections to developments in East Central Europe, with a certain familiarity in the Hungarian community with the developments in Hungary per se, and with a certain cultural interest on the part of a larger educated public in Romania prior to 1989, in the transformations taking place in Poland after 1980, earlier to a lesser extent in the Czech and Czechoslovakia in 1968. What was going on south of the Danube remained more or less enigmatic, although from Bucharest lots of people were watching Bulgarian television because they were broadcasting football matches more frequently than the decaying Romanian television. But I think this was pretty much reduced at that. One thing that is connecting the whole area is indeed national identities, or let's say group identities. The fact that Kosovo was not recognized by Romania has to do with that. The fact that Spain doesn't recognize Kosovo has to do with that, with the perceived threat of a precedent in diplomatic and geopolitical terms of the recognition, of the official recognition of a seceding part of a subject of international law, and thus the creation of a precedent for other sub-state minorities such as the Catalans, the Hungarians in Romania, others elsewhere. This being said, there is a striking similarity in the treatment of minorities all over the area. And I think this has to do with the longer term history of this area and with the unresolved, tensions and identity problems of the left behind by the Balkan Wars and by World War I. I think the geopolitical organization of this space remained an unfinished project. In many ways, it is an unfinished project south of the Danube today. If we think of the difficult recognition of the Republic of Macedonia, we have one thing. But if we also think of the difficult coexistence of the various ethnic groups in the Republic of Northern Macedonia, we also get a different picture. Probably from outside, from the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Slovenia is the one that managed to escape somewhere into a kind of hinterland of Austria and Italy recently, as far as I can gather from the image of Slovenia and Italy. Croatia is hovering or is navigating very troubled waters. Serbia is trying to sort out its issues, especially with Kosovo, but also with Croatia. So it's a lot of unfinished business on the ground in ethnic, collective identity, geopolitical terms. What unites these countries is the mass migration phenomenon. Indeed, we were not, how shall I say, we knew, and I knew in Romania before 1989 of all this turmoil in Bulgaria and the the crisis with the Turkish-speaking population, and so forth. But I think they only opened a longer-term process, which is not finished yet, by which the solution to local problems on the ground is emigration. The solution to the crisis are not found on the ground, and that's the only way to. It's a kind of voluntary ethnic cleansing by mass migration. In Romania, obviously the German population has disappeared after 1990. Choosing between being a citizen of Germany and a citizen of Romania is easy. Well, at the time anyhow, it was quite easy how they chose. There was, in the meantime, a mass migration of the entire population, all collective identities included, which amounts to about 25%, if not more, of the general population. Similar percentages apply to Bulgaria. Albania was a pioneer in this respect because most of the Albanian population has already had an experience abroad, an experience of migration, even temporary, in the first 10 years after the fall of Hoxha's regime. So they were the first, the most ubiquitous mass migrants from, let's say, the paradigmatic mass migrants from the Balkans. But indeed, these phenomena, which proved to be longer lasting than the collapse of the economic structures of communism and of the power structures of communism themselves, passed almost unnoticed in 1989. We were busy looking at other events, expecting other developments, and were not so keen on following these displacements of collective identities in their region. What is the legacy of this all? I think still mass migration. Otherwise, I think we can easily compare the new elites of these countries because they pretty much share the same pattern of evolution. They go back to the pre-1989 nomenclatura and secret services. This is, I think, true quite obviously overall. It would take a good mass prosopography of the ruling elites in Eastern Europe to realize how closely related the current elites and the former can be. Sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters, cousins, and so forth, all over the place. This is also something that in Romania and in the Balkan states is striking. I mean, this kind of persistence in power of dynasties of the former nomenclatura, readjusting to a situation, let's say, of nominal democracy. This is true in the countries of the European Union, those countries that acceded to the European Union, as it is in those that are still knocking on that door. If I were to sum up the, let's say, whatever happened in these 30 years, I think this would be this: a massive loss of population in all of these countries, and repositioning of the former elites with very little, let's say, challenge from the supposedly new forms representing alternative oppositional strata, milieus, classes, and so forth. So what strikes me, if I look around 30 years on, is the rather successful self-reproduction of the elites of this in 1990 would have been in 1989 would have seemed a provocation if formulated as a prophecy in Eastern Europe, but it seems to be the way history proceeded. So if we go beyond the details of these transformations, we can see a rather successful. So I will close with this. François Furet wrote this famous book in 1978, which is titled Penser la Révolution Française. And the beginning of this, the first statement is La Révolution Française est terminée. The French Revolution has ended. We are still in the beginning of that process, and I think it would be too early to say that the 1989 revolution was finished. In 1989, he received a Légion d'honneur from the government, and Furet told me once that this is the precise proof that nobody has ever read his book. So, because the revolutions in this part of the world have disappeared, interestingly, as a legitimating narrative. Nobody legitimates him or herself now on the basis of the revolution. Romania would be the last country where such thing would happen, because nobody really can explain, even today, whatever happened, who, by whom, why, this and that, how long, to what extent. And so, if this is not used as a legitimating narrative, it may be that nobody needs legitimating narratives any longer, since they are in control of most leverages and networks in these countries, and simply this is the fact of history. 1989 has just happened, and that's it. It's just a banal transformation, and in the cycle of all revolutions, which are always more restorations than revolutions. So probably 1989, like 1789, is not an exception to this rule. Questions and comments? Yes?
Well, I find that very interesting what you said, and also what Mr. Fritz said, because I'm relatively new to Romania, and so when this year we are celebrating the 30 years of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I realized that this change, 89 and the 90s, is kind of an obscure issue here in Romania, and I thought that's maybe due to my ignorance, but somehow it seems that there is not such a positive notion with a year, as of course you have related to, but still I would like to know more about why is it so obscure, because, I mean, in the end, it led to freedom, and it put the Ceausescus to an end, which was certainly a positive event, not for them anyways, but for the people, I would think. So why is it that there are so mixed feelings about the liberation? Is it because of the hardships that followed? But then there were certain hardships before. What would you say to that? And my second question, if we still have time, I don't want to monopolize this, but my second question would be, considering Romania's national psyche, how do these events still influence its behavior on the international scene? Do you see some patterns that you could also see in other countries that share the same experience, or how would you, I don't know, see that?
The Romanian psyche, this is for a German scholar, the Volksgeist.
Yes, why not?
Let him answer that.
I'm not an expert on Romania, but concerning Bulgaria, I can say that it was a communist dictatorship on the surface, but underneath it was an extremely nationalist regime, and that is the reason why perception of many Bulgarians today, when they look back to 1989, are very ambivalent. There is always this talk of unfinished business. They say, well, that's typical for the communists. they started the business of getting Islam out of Bulgaria, but they did not do it till the end. And now we sit here and we still have a huge Muslim minority. And so communists have not fulfilled this national task. And that is also the reason why this all these events of the 1980s, name change campaign, mass flight, and so on, is not tackled publicly. It's not an issue. It's so to speak the elephant in the room. In Kosovo, well, naturally, 1989 is perceived as an absolute catastrophe, and of course that is quite a difference to Romania, where, well, I would assume also this ambivalent perception prevails, that people say yes, liberalization, democracy, market economy, fine, but my standard of living decreased considerably, even compared to the extremely negative 1980s in Romania. So, and I think that is a strong difference. Or when we compare it, for example, to Germany, at the narrative 10 years before, at the 20th anniversary of 1989, was an extremely positive one, whereas now, 30 years after, suddenly ambivalence is back. And well, there is this ongoing discussion in a German daily, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which started in June, and increasingly contributors say all this euphoria and so on, that was premature. We were euphoric, but then came Treuhand and crushed all our positive whatever.
Which was this huge economic holding that was privatizing East Germany, which was also a site of extraordinary financial speculation and abuse and theft, and dispossession of the losing partner in the Wiedervereinigung process, and this has created over time interesting. In Leipzig, however, talking to people at the grassroots level, I also got this remark from someone who told me that the guy from the Treuhand who had disappeared in Florida with those billions of had started all kinds of huge projects in East Germany, including Leipzig, the tunnel and the transformation of the railway station into a nice shopping mall, all that. He should be given a medal, or a statue should be erected in his name, because he said, of course, he started to speculate and all that, but launched enormous building sites and projects that are necessary, most of them, and then here you go, we have them. Because we are serious, and we, with the exception of Berlin-Brandenburg Airport, the Germans finished their projects. So they started under the sign of fraud and speculation, but they did it. In Romania, the communist state very early started to sort out the national problem by allowing Jews to emigrate. But this was because communists of Jewish origin, some of them were supportive of Zionism and were allowing them to leave. So let's say that they were starting to sort out the unfinished business of the 1930s and 40s in Romania, to get rid of the survivors of the Holocaust, send them off to their new state or wherever they wanted to go. One thing. Secondly, the Romanian state remembered that money can be earned out of this, and they started selling Jews later on to the state of Israel, selling Germans to, we had no other buyers, so the other national minorities remained on the ground. The last wave of German migration, as you know, was voluntary in 1990 and soon thereafter. There was a moment of also voluntary immigration of the German minority from 82 on, for fear of the new nationalistic policies of the Communist Party, which are now asking for compensation, financial compensation from German candidates to immigration for everything from education to housing to summer camps as pioneers and so forth. So they were galvanized by this possibility, and from the fall of 1982 there was a rather interesting high wave of migration, which was sponsored by the German state to the same extent that was sponsored by some of the more wealthier families. Today, mass migration affects all communities that are still in Romania. In percentage terms, my feeling is that the Gypsies are the most successful mass migrants or mass migrant community. I think probably up to 75–80% of them are just, you meet them in the West when you look around. They are not here anymore, most of them. Hungarians had the experience of migrating to Hungary with mixed results, because they are perceived as Romanians in many cases there, and this is not such a good idea in Hungary. So this immigration has slowed down considerably. People would have expected, no, they are kept here because of, from all kinds of reasons. They want to stay there and stay on the land they have been on since, the end of the first millennium. So there is this kind of identity of landespatriotismus, of cultural identity, but also the fact that Hungary is not really welcoming beyond the level of proclamations of, giving them nice certificates and things like that. But the certificates are not useful anymore. We give similar citizenship rights to the Bessarabians, to the Republic of Moldova, to the citizens. But there is a catch there, because they can emigrate to Italy immediately, you see. Whereas a Hungarian from Romania already can go to wherever they want. They don't need anything from Hungary anymore. The collective psyche is something very elusive. I don't want to get into this. I think all things considered, 30 years on, some of the inevitable processes of democratization, those that are really inevitable, structural, happened anyway. I do not quite see the voluntary agents of democratization in any of these processes. I mean, I can see here and there militants that are pushing in this or that direction. This is mostly an experience of the 1990s, I would say. I can't see it crystallizing at the level of the political spectrum with tangible results. I simply don't see it. Maybe a change of generations has simply disconnected the agendas, which is probably normal, the agendas of the current generation from those of the 1980s are now prehistory for most living Romanians. And I think nationalism, yeah, there are milieus in which national identity is very important. At the level of popular culture, on the internet, but at low levels of, let's say, intellectual elaboration and so forth. I don't see a major, some of this was taken over by religious fundamentalism and somehow conflated with, in a kind of generic Christian Romanian identity in which the proportions are difficult to separate. And that is new. Has something to do with the 1930s, but very little, I think, in the end. And thus people remember the hardships of the 1980s, those who lived through them. Everybody else remembers, I think, depending on the age, from personal experience, the hardships of the 1990s, the economic hardships of the 1990s. And they preserve a kind of, today we live in a situation in which political and social dissatisfaction are much higher than the standards of living would indicate. So there is a kind of spagat between everyday life experiences of relative, well, not prosperity, at least survivability, and the political, ideological dissatisfaction. To where this is going to lead, we'll see in the next years. Dragos Petrescu.
Actually, I have a question, not necessarily related to Southeast Europe, but to Central Europe. Actually, 20 years after, we see authoritarian backsliding, liberal democracies were exactly developing in the front runners of the 1989 change. Of course, it was a change in the sense that it started in Hungary in 2010 and Poland followed suit. At least in Romania, we see a lack of populist consensus that we see in Poland and Hungary. So perhaps 89 in Romania also brought about the birth, not rebirth of democracy, rather political subculture of contestation, because we have people protesting. At least we don't have this instrumentalization of nationalism is not possible. At least we have a proof. The utter failure of the last year campaign, 100 years of Greater Romania, it was an emphasis on nationalism, but it didn't work. It was conducted like entire Romania in the Song of Praise National Festival, everything under 100, but it didn't really work. So perhaps Professor Trust have also an idea of what really happened in Hungary and Poland. This is related to 89, the negotiated transition, the peaceful change.
I think it's very difficult, for example, in the Polish case, to construct a direct line from Solidarność in the 1980s to peace today. I mean,
Yes.
I don't see any continuity. Maybe a remark which I forgot in my presentation concerning Victor Meyer's article, which was very unusual in that regard, that at a time when Western experts forecast the implosion of the Soviet Union due to inter-ethnic conflict, for example, the famous book by Hélène Carrère-Dorcas, she predicted in 82, I think,
Yes.
the implosion of the Soviet Union due to inter-ethnic conflict warfare, which did not take place. I remember also this, the Radio Free Europe expert on Romania, Robert King, in 1980 published an interesting book on minority questions in Eastern Europe, and he made a ranking where first the most dangerous inter-ethnic conflicts will break out, and number one was Transylvania. Number two was Macedonia. He didn't have Kosovo on his own map, so he was completely wrong. And Meyer's argument was that the regimes, Belgrade, Sofia, Bucharest, but particularly Belgrade and Sofia, they turned to an effective way of stabilizing their own regimes by increasing nationalism, by clamping down on national minorities. And so his view was not that inter-ethnic conflict, that is the actual danger for this type of regimes, but his argument was the other one, the other way around. He said, these regimes can stabilize themselves by playing the nationalist card and winning over the majority populations to their own program, maybe not to their ideology, but to their nationalist program. Well, of course, he wrote his article in September 89, so very soon his prediction was no longer valid, and of course for Romania, I admit that this case of this systematization campaign is something else than this extreme nationalism,
Yes.
which was applied by Belgrade
Yes,
in
it
Kosovo.
was read as essentially and in fact exclusively a nationalist policy, but in fact it was more than that. And it was a more complex project. It was crazy, all right, but it was not. It didn't have as the first target the
Minorities.
erasure of the minorities. But since the first echoes of this movement started through the Hungarian population that themselves were reinterpreting this systematization as an anti-Hungarian policy, this also what was picked up by the foreign media and so forth. Although, for instance, the Opération Village Roumain, which was established in that period and was very active trying to establish connections to Romania by the adoption by every village in France of a village in Romania and so forth, they were not really keen on the idea of repression of minorities. They were affecting this. Elenca Dancos had this bias that she was seeing the Soviet Union through the Caucasus lens. And of course, the Caucasus is pretty agitated. She herself has family connection to Georgia, and she was seeing this as a potential place of collapse. Well, we haven't seen yet a form of populism that would be comparable to those in Hungary and in Poland. There were attempts, but they were missed attempts. There were failures. Some of the leaders of such potential were simply not serious at all, and the population realized it too soon. And Vadim Tudor and others, I mean, really, they were so beyond some nice inflated proclamations. They simply were not serious to be taken seriously by. They could not inspire mass demonstrations. They were just salon, not salon fait, but salon kind of pseudo-politicians. They didn't go too far. The Social Democratic Party picked up some of these lines, but they are not serious about them because they don't need it. They can, local elites in Romania don't need this. They can rule as a normal transnational or trans-ethnic mafia-like system of networks without any problem. When they were cutting the woods hand in hand, the Hungarians and the Romanians, they really didn't seem to have any kind of ethnic problem. So I think such, in Hungary, I think this kind of, Orban's populism is also a kind of revenge on Budapest after years of perceived oppression by the sons and daughters of Kada's nomenclatura, and this is now the revanche of of us Hungarians from the countryside, little boroughs and so forth, who couldn't steal, didn't steal because they couldn't, or others who were stealing more quickly the big assets of post-communist Hungary, so they had to collect everything else from the provinces. In Romania, I think it was easy. The guys who were in power in 1990 could take everything by storm and keep it. Now there is a little problem of transmission of property, a generational problem of transmission of property. I think this is going to be sorted out quite soon. So when you don't need populism, why complicate your life with it if you can run it through nice democratic pro-European and this failure of the festival devoted to the 100 years of Greater Romania, because nobody believed in it. I will always remember how probably in about 10 days universities, institutions of all sorts, all the institutions of the state had to place the symbol of 100 years, a kind of infinity with that, on their letterheads. And the nicest example I have is that the fiscal, the Garda Financiara, the financial guard, the Guardia di Finanza, handed the paper to the Cotroceni National Museum, and I was shown this paper. It was about, and it was about the control. They were, so all this was presented as the festive sign of the centennial. It was just a routine financial control, had nothing to do with the centennial. And then everything Romania has this capacity, and we finish with this. We get into the problem of the national psyche. Romanians are always surprised when round figures, when anniversaries like this come up. They're totally taken by surprise. In 2018, they suddenly discovered that there was such a thing as 1918. Look into the newspapers of 2017, and you'll find very few projects to commemorate. Go into the programs of all the ministries in Romania and see very little or planning for then they started late. They had to spend all that money. Was the result. Stefan Trops, thank you very much for taking the trouble to come to us. Thank you very much, and thank you all out there on YouTube. We'll meet for another discussion on 1989, focusing on the peaceful revolution in Leipzig, the antithesis of the Dracula kind of bloody revolution in Romania, which is only fair, on the 4th at 6 p.m. So come here. There will be a lot of people from Leipzig, including Matthias Midel from the University of Leipzig, and others from the museums in Leipzig and the City Hall of Leipzig. Thank you very much, and I'll see you then. Thanks.